Today's topic will include themes of grooming, sexual abuse, suicidal ideation, and malnutrition, which some listeners may find disturbing or triggering. We encourage all listeners to prioritize their own mental health and well-being, and to only engage with this content if you feel you are able. Dissonant dialogues sometimes means difficult dialogues, and this topic may be our most difficult so far. So if you won't be joining us today, we see you, we love you, and feel free to check out our other episodes. Most importantly, Dissonant Dialogues is never disrespectful. We both strive to create a safe community of classical musicians and the people who love them, to talk about the unfortunate realities of the music world. Please keep in mind that the stories you hear today are a fraction of a lived experience, and that no one is owed every detail of another individual's trauma. We ask that you avoid speculation about any undisclosed identities or making assumptions about what actions may or may not have been taken in the aftermath of the abuse. Most importantly, victim blaming, harassment, objectification, trolling, or shaming will not ever be tolerated on any of our platforms. This is for both our safety and the safety of our audience. Please do not hesitate to report inappropriate comments or bring them to my attention at Undead Mezzo on Instagram if we miss anything.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dissonant Dialogues. I'm Emily, and I'm here with Claire. Claire, how are you doing today?
I'm hanging in there. How are you?
Same. Claire and I have had a rough week. We might do
It's
a
been
podcast
weird.
episode on the chaos that has emerged into our lives, but as of right now, I think we're emerging from it. We are on the other side, I hope.
I think.
For today, we are going to be concluding my story, talking about part 3. So far we talked about psychological grooming. We've talked about how that can lead into sexual abuse. And we kind of left off right where I spoke out anonymously. And everything was just kind of left up in the air like that. So this episode is all going to be about the aftermath, about speaking out, what it was like for me, positive reactions that I got, and a lot of negative reactions that I got. So we'll get into a good swarm of reality, what that's like when you speak out, especially when sexual abuse happens in a school setting by a professor. But specifically when the abuse occurs on campus, because then the school is involved, faculty, students, there's so many different perspectives that are going to be coming around. And how different people responded. This can definitely be very triggering to hear. I know that even just talking about it and remembering the reactions of these people is very upsetting, because we want it to be a safe place. We want to be able to speak out and have support. It's hard enough to speak out, but when you're speaking out and people are angry at you for it, it makes it so much harder. So we were actually recording this episode on almost exactly a year since I spoke out, which was July 25th. That was the last day I had contact with my abuser. And it is July 26th today that we are filming this. So we're really talking about things that happened a year ago and basically on that day. So crazy. We left off after I shared Sasha's story to my Instagram page. And I said I was sharing for my friend, Sasha. And after I did that, that was after the professor had stopped messaging me. I cried in my bedroom for a long time. I remember after I posted that, I was just really realizing how stuck I was, because school was only like a month away. I was going to be going back, and I was like, wow, nothing's going to change no matter what I do. I had to get up because I was going to house sit and pet sit for somebody. And while I was on my way there, I remember seeing a text come down, and it was from one of my violin teacher's teaching assistants, somebody I really looked up to as a wonderful musician. And he messaged me and he was like, hey, I just want to let you know, I saw what you posted. And despite all the details you did to hide everything, I read through everything, and I know this is your story. And I know that this is what happened to you. And I just want to let you know in case other people figure it out, and people can gossip and go crazy. And he was so sweet about it, though. He was like, I just want to let you know, it's totally up to you. Like, you can tell me to F off. He's like, I just want you to know so that you're prepared, like, in case anybody figures it out. And I remember at that point, I was like, I was in denial. I'm like, no one else, like, you're a teacher. Okay. So maybe you have like teacher brain. You can like see it in me. You could figure it out. No one cares. Nobody cares about me. No one's going to figure it out. So I thanked him. And yeah.
Do you know how how he knew it was you?
He was the one that recommended for me to read The Body Keeps the Score, which is, I think, what was a big change for me. I think he paid a little bit more extra attention. I wonder sometimes if he has his own trauma, and if seeing the stuff I was posting about sexual assault, like if that clicked to him. And then I think he just paid a little more attention to me. Not many people were really paying attention to me. So I think that's why he was one that figured it out. Then I looked at my phone in Instagram DM, and I got messages from 2 graduates that I also really, really looked up to. They gave me the support that I needed. They knew it was my story, but they also knew who it was. They figured that out. And I was like, well, how do you, like, how are you figuring out? They didn't say his name too. They're just like, okay, it's very obvious. Like, I know who it is. If this happened to you, I know. And I'm like, well, how? And they're like, well, we've seen you in his office. People were saying we've seen you crying in his office. We've seen him telling you to come back to his office. We know that you celebrated Christmas with them. They just put everything together. And it was like they'd seen the signs, but it still wasn't enough for them to come to me and say something while it was happening. It's like no one wanted to say anything. But as soon as the story was out, it's like, oh yeah, okay. Yeah, like we know. I told one of the girls, I was like, can you just please make sure like this does not, like, don't tell anybody, like try not to get this to like go around, because I'm not ready for everybody to know. I wanted some support like that felt good, but I'm like, I'm not ready for everybody to know that this is me, and especially him. We all know it was going to happen then. And I remember her response, she's like, oh, I think everybody knows. And she's like, it's getting around very fast and people are furious for you. And she said, like, I remember the message, I wouldn't be surprised if it's not already gotten to him. And the panic, the fear, the terror in my body. And then I was already back in my bedroom, and I was just like, oh my God. And all I was thinking was like, what did I do? I'm not ready for this. Yes, I have evidence, but I feel like I didn't have enough. And I'm like, I'm just not ready. It's like hyperventilating, and one of the texts that I sent, in pure panic, I'm like, he's going to kill me. I'm like, he's literally going to kill me. And because I didn't put anything past him. I was like, this was a mistake. And she was being kind of like, no, you did the right thing. You need to. And she was just encouraging me to report to our school's Title IX. And I was like, but I can't. And she's like, just do it. And then once this is all over, you'll be able to finally heal. And she was just, okay. I did not know her that well. I mean, I looked up to her. We went to school together, but I was so isolated. I really did not know her that well. And she was still like much older than me. Those 3 people I'd mentioned, they were all older than me, graduate level students who were in grad school or already graduated, or teacher. Like, they were not people around my age. That entire day, I was terrified of my phone. I was so worried to look at it to see if he texted me, but I also wanted to keep looking at it because I needed to know if something was going to happen. Contemplating, should I delete this or should I keep it up? And like, but I worked hard on putting it out there to bring awareness. That's important to me. So I left everything up. And then I was teaching a music camp that week. So somehow, it was that evening, I had to get up, get myself together, and get ready and head to camp. And I don't know how I did it, but yeah, I got up, got ready to go, and I left. And I had actually scheduled with the teacher at the camp to tell her what had happened to me. I remembered when I went to Allstate, there were little like seminars is what the word is, I would call it. And she told me, she's like, okay, just so you know, like, I'm going to be going to this one with a few other teachers, and it's about like sexual abuse and between like teachers and students and being like safe and careful. That's not something I really want you to see. So you can like go and do this thing. And I had a vague memory of that from Allstate. And I was like, maybe like she knows something that can protect me, because it's not as simple as you report and you're safe. And I had emailed her that day as the chaos was going on. And I'm like, can we please, like, can we just go to camp a little earlier and just talk about some stuff? I think I said something like, there's something really big going on, and it can't wait. We were going to wait till later on in the week, but I'm like, it's escalating. We seriously need to meet. And so she was like, yeah, okay, no problem. I had my phone off because I didn't want to be scared, like jolted by a message from him. And I got to the office space before she did, and I set my stuff down, and I looked at my phone, and I saw that my mom was calling me. And I was so flustered, and I answered the phone. I'm like, come on, like, I'm about to tell this teacher that I looked up to, she's my teacher, the awful stuff that's happened to me. And I'm flustered, and I have all this stuff going on. I answer the phone, and I'm just like, what? And she's like, there's a police officer here. Said like, he's saying something about like that you're going to kill yourself with like drugs and alcohol and stuff. And that was it, where I knew he knew. And he called the police. And then it was clarified that a professor had called for me and said that I was at risk of hurting myself. And that was the very first time over the phone. I'm like, no, that is not what's happening here. Obviously, I'm at camp right now. I said, I'm like, it's that professor assaulted me, is the word I said.
So your mom didn't know you had posted anything at that point?
No, she had no idea of anything. I mean, to be fair, she was really sick, leukemia. She doesn't even remember like half of the stuff during that time in any of our lives. Like if I ask her anything, like it's a chemo reaction. Sometimes she has trouble remembering things. And she's like, what do you mean assaulted? I'll never forget that. And I was like so mad. And I'm sitting in the office and I'm like, sexually, like he sexually assaulted me. And that was the first time I said those words before. Because I couldn't say them out loud. I would go around anyway. Most of the time we called it the office stuff. Like between him and I, that's the way he wanted to talk about it. So when I talked about it to my therapist and I talked about it to other people, I said the office stuff, which sounds very strange when I think about it now, but that's what it meant. It was uncomfortable saying that word, but I think because I waited so long, when I finally said it, it brought me a little bit of peace. And then they just said, like, the police are either going to come to you or you have to come back home and talk to them. And so I had to leave camp. And I left like bawling my eyes out, and I was mad. They had me like leading the camp, the warm up for the first time. And I was still getting used to teaching large groups, and I had to miss the warm up I was supposed to lead. So I didn't get that opportunity. And while I was on my way back, the other teacher was coming into the school, and I'm like, I'm so sorry, there's police at my house. I have to go. And she's like, you're fine. You take your time, you do your thing. And I'm like, thank you. On the way back, I tried calling my therapist. I'd never called my therapist before, ever. And she knew the stuff that was going on because I emailed her and I was like, oh my God, like I posted this, and I guess it was kind of spontaneous, but like I didn't really think that so many people would figure it out and spin it around and get everywhere like that. I just told them, I was like, they can't like take me away to some mental institution because that's what the professor said would happen. And that's what he said he would do to me. Now he was doing it. So I was like, what do I do? And she's like, well, okay, relax. Like you have to let yourself calm down. You have to appear calm in front of them. You have to explain the reality of the situation. You have to tell them what has happened so they know why all this is going on and why he called for you. And she also offered, like, you can call me when you get there and they can talk to me and I'll tell them that you're okay. And I kept like telling myself, like, I couldn't be me. Like, Emily's not strong enough to handle this right now. I threw myself away and I was just like, I pretended like I was confident and I could handle the situation. The lieutenant pulled me outside, and I remember when we were talking, and right away he's like, your mom said something about a professor assaulting you. He's like, what has happened? And I, vaguely kind of went over what exactly has happened. And he started to get like very angry and flustered. And he was like, he's trying to talk to myself. He's like, oh, I'm sorry. I just have a daughter that's like around your age. And the fact that like this has happened by a professor, he was so mad hearing that had happened to me. He was so flustered, and I was just so happy. And because he's like, I believe you. I totally believe you. Like, I know you're not a threat to yourself. And I'm like, thank the Lord. And I'm like, okay, so I'm fine. Like, the professor's tactics didn't work. I'm okay. And he gave me his card, and he said about reporting to the school in Title IX. And he said, every university should have a police station, or not station, but police, like, where if you report something like this, you should right away talk to police. And he said, if you need any help with that, you let me know. He gave me his card because he recommended I get a restraining order from the professor. And he's like, here, if you have any questions about how to do that, how would I know how to do that? I was 21 and I already had a lot of my life taken away from him. And he's like, you call me or you come down to the station, I'll explain what you do and where you go. And then I had to go back inside. This is something that is probably gonna make everybody's stomachs like churn if you're thinking about your parents in the situation. And they're like, what happened? Like, what's going on? And I so vaguely kind of like went over the timeline, and I was mostly like yelling at them in it too. And I didn't have support. So I was very angry. And I'll just say, I remember my dad was very quiet. He didn't really say anything. And my mom was like, you got to put him in jail, which is so unrealistic. The way she was like, you have to put him in jail. And you know what I said to that, though? I was like, yeah. And then I have to live with the fact that I destroyed his family. That's what I said back. And my mom's response was something like, no, he did that. Like, you didn't destroy his family. I'm like, what? I said, like, I have to get back to work. I'm like, I have to get back to work now. So bye. My mom's like, well, you're just going to, and I'm like, yeah, I have to go back to work. I was just like, I have to do what I have to do. And I got back in my car, and in my car, I remember like, I blocked the professor for one. I blocked his number for safety. His wife was already blocked as well. And I called one of my friends that I had told over the summer. I know since high school, and she kind of got me like talking and laughing in the car on my way back. And I remember as I was walking up to the school then to go into the camp that already started, I did a video on my phone, and I was crying in the video. No one was outside. And I posted on Instagram, and I said, okay, he knows you guys were right. You guessed it right. And like, I don't know what I'm going to do now, but I have to do something. It was something along the lines like that. Then I went into the building, and the thing with being alone with kids, where he's like, you shouldn't be alone with kids. I was put alone with a group of cellists, and I just had to teach them like nothing was
Yeah.
happening. I fought so hard to put the biggest fake smile on my face for those kids as best as I could.
Mhm.
And then after the camp had ended, I stayed after with the teacher of the camp, who was my high school orchestra director, and I told her everything that had been going on. And I'm like, well, I guess I don't really need your advice anymore, but I wanted to let you know why I had to leave and then why I was late. And she's like, that's totally understandable. Like, you're fine. And just
Yeah.
making sure I was okay and stuff. It was all female workers at the camp, and they were all very kind and respectful of my situation, because that
Mhm.
week, they all go out to eat then for a lunch or a dinner before camp. And they did, but I had to miss it because I was dealing with this whole situation. Around this time, though, I was getting hundreds, near thousands of DMs from like strangers or old high school friends, different colleagues, people saying, like, telling me their stories. Like, everyone just figuring out that it was me. I didn't even mention the entire day. I was on my Instagram and I was posting stuff saying, it's not who you think it is. It's not who you think it is,
Mhm.
because everybody was thinking it was my story and it was that professor. And I kept denying and denying and denying, trying to protect him, which is so sickening. But that's all I was doing the whole day. And so that's why I did that video then. And I was like, fine, okay, you guys were right. But I went through the DMs over time, and majority of them, like on my page, were very respectful at that time. And just, I'd say like 95% of them were people telling me their stories and saying, yeah, I was assaulted by a boyfriend, by my father, by a professor, and saying, I've never told anyone this before, but I'm just so inspired by the fact that you spoke out, and you spoke out so publicly. And like, you're going to see that pattern of everybody like having a story too. You're already seeing it, right? With the people I told. And
that was my pattern,
Yeah, and it's not that, oh yeah, this happened to me and now my abuser's in jail. It's, this happened to me and I didn't get the opportunity to report, or someone shut them down along the way, which sure, you'll see that pattern. So it was flustering that I was getting, because I was feeling bad for those people, and I'm like, God, and they just have to go on knowing that the person that abused them goes free. It didn't mean anything to anybody else. That night, I had made the decision then that I was going to report to Title IX. And I spent like that week like trying to compile all the evidence that I had, making sure I didn't miss anything. I went through like all of my phone and my laptop trying to see, like, did I record anything else I didn't know of? Like, is there, like, I didn't trust my mind because I knew I was so sick and so malnourished. I'm like, I probably forgot something. I also had to write a summary of like details of what I could remember from that time. I mean, this was over 2 years, right? So I'm trying to remember everything over 2 years and write as much down. And I think I clarified in there too, like to an email to the person. I was like, just so you know, there's probably more. I'm trying to remember everything and write everything down. And I didn't know what was important. Do they care about the fact that he was pushing me to send audios I didn't want to? Do they care about the fact that he was hugging me in his office? Was that bad? Or did they only care about the office stuff? I didn't know. There were also people reporting for me before I decided to that evening. There were people going to Title IX reporting for me, which I appreciate. But I just thought it was funny that I sent an email then to her, and I was like, I want to report this. Please let me know what I have to do. And I got an email back the next day, and she was like, it's been brought to my attention by other students that you may have something to report. And then like a while later, she was like, oh, I see you already put in something to report. So I'm like, okay, this is already messy. How did you respond to them before you responded to my own? So I sent in all my stuff, and then she wanted to meet with me on Zoom to talk through like what the process looked like. And she was very strict on like, we do not talk about anything except what the process is going to be like. That is all. And the conclusion of that was, she said, with all of my evidence that I had his admission, and I had tons and tons of other stuff. He would still be working at the school for at least 90 to 120 days if they even decided to investigate, because they haven't decided if it was worth investigating yet. I remember my response. I was like, so what you're saying is that, because school started in a month, I'm definitely going to be seeing him at school this year, at least for like the first few months. And she was like, yes. And I was like, but I did the thing. I told you. I have the evidence still. I didn't delete it, even though you wanted me to delete it, even though I wanted to delete and forget everything. I did what you wanted me to do. And I still have to see him on campus all the time. He's still in that, he's going to be in that office, and he's going to be around everything. I told them, I'm like, I can guarantee you there is still evidence in that office. And they let him go into the office and clean it and go through all of his stuff. They let him have access into there. So the clipboards that were still against the windows with the shades down, the towels that he used with his own stuff on it, tissues in the garbage. I know that also was still there. He never cleaned. He never emptied his garbage. And honestly, who knows what else was in there? He had a locked closet in his office as well.
Title IX should have involved police right away, because
They never did.
police,
Yeah.
for all of the police's flaws, they would have said, you can't touch that. That's evidence.
Exactly. Yeah, they never had me speak with police. And that was something, yeah, I had so much going on in my mind. I wasn't remembering the lieutenant telling me they'll have you speak with police. I was just thinking, okay, I do what they tell me. I'm doing the process. I'm doing the things.
Yeah.
And I didn't think like, oh yeah, shouldn't I be talking to police? Like,
but it's not your
later on
job
it
to
came.
think that. Like, you know, that should have been, other people should have been doing that for you. Of course, you're not going to know. You've never done this before.
Mm-hmm. And that was a
Incredibly
time
negligent.
where I found out that consensual relations between students and professors are allowed at my school. They are allowed. So that was one of the things where all they were doing then was trying to prove that it wasn't consensual. And I did have evidence that it wasn't consensual. I mean, I had texts, but most importantly, I had the recorded phone call of him admitting to continuing when I said not to. But I think that did slow the process down, just because they allowed that. And what is a consensual relationship between a student and a professor?
That's a great question. I've been wondering that myself.
Doesn't exist. It's not like it's encouraged, right? Like, they're going to say it's frowned upon. I think they're saying that they don't have a way to pursue that legally if it is consensual. But you're right, there is no consent within that power dynamic. That's physically impossible.
Yes. So my other next step that I had to do, I was so busy. This was like a full-time job. Reporting is a full-time job.
Of course.
And I had to obtain witness statements. So all the people that had messaged me saying, oh, I saw you leaving his office crying a lot. I saw him yelling at you in his office. I saw him telling you to stay after class. I saw you looking miserable in his office was another thing. Another person heard the door lock when I was in there. So, and people saw the shades down. They saw him acting aggressively towards me, like all these things. So I'm like, okay, witness statements. And I made sure they were comfortable, you know, speaking on my behalf, even anonymously. The following week, I had another music camp. And that one was like an all day, 7 days sort of thing. It would be my third year working at that camp. So I reached out to be called our lead TA, because I was a teaching assistant as well. So it was our lead TA. And I explained to her, she was closer to my age. So I explained to her my situation. And I asked her, I'm like, should I just not go to the camp this year? Because I'm worried I'm going to have to step out partway through and deal with the situation. And I asked for that. And she said, you know what, it's totally up to you. Like, you are more than welcome to come and do as much as you can. Okay. And she clarified that she would speak to the lady that's like in charge of the entire camp about my situation. So those accommodations were set in place. And so I didn't have to worry about it. So I was like, good, someone's got my back, something less that I have to worry about. And the person that was in charge of the camp, English is not her first language, and I've been teaching there for 3 years. So the communications with her were always really, really difficult. And I'm like, okay, how do I explain this to her? So I was glad the TA, easier for them to communicate to. I was glad that the TA was like, I can communicate this to her. You'll be okay. So I was like, all right. At this camp, my best friend, I guess, she was supposed to be working there too. She started working there a year after I did. I knew I'd be seeing her, and she'd never reached out, right? This was all going on like publicly. I knew it had to have reached her. So I reached out to her a week after, and I apologized for not being a good friend while I was dealing with the abuse. And her response was kind of just like, yeah, sorry to hear that this is going on. Like, it wasn't anything bad, but just saying, you know, she responded back and just said, yeah, I'm sorry to hear that, whatever. As the camp was going on, like partway through the week, there were kind of conversations that would spark up about it. And her comment that really kind of did it for me was when she's like, you know, I'd prefer to stay out of this because it has nothing to do with me. And I was like in shock. And I was like, well, how does what happened to me, like, I'm your friend, right? How does that have nothing to do with you? And she wouldn't sign the petition. We didn't mention the petition yet that was going around that someone else set up. She wouldn't sign the petition that was going on. She wouldn't.
I didn't know that's gross.
Yeah, she wanted nothing to do. She didn't want to talk about anything or be a part of it in any way. That entire day at camp, the TAs ignored me. They would not talk to me. I was crying in private spaces alone when I had like little like snippets between the day. One of my former teachers that was working there on the faculty as well. And I went to him and I was like, I don't think I can do this. And he was trying to encourage me to stay and to keep doing it. And then he brought up, he's like, yeah, you know, I found out just from my doctor a text that I might have a cancerous brain tumor. And I was like, what? Like, he told me this. He's like, I just found this out and I'm still staying here. And that was where I was like, okay, this is not a healthy response.
Yeah, like, I don't know how I feel about that.
I finally decided when it was lunchtime And I went to sit down, like I sat down, and then a load of TAs came in together, and they all looked at me, and they sat on the furthest opposite of the lunchroom talking together. And my best friend was also there. And that was finally, I couldn't stop myself from crying. I went to my car, I texted the lead TA, and I was like, I was right, I can't do this. And I explained the situation. I gave the stuff I needed to give to people. And then I left, and she was like, okay, like you're good, you're fine. And I apologized like relentlessly. Fast forward, when it was this past summer, it was going to be my 4th year teaching there. And I was fired, and I wasn't told I was fired. I just hadn't, I like put in the application we have to do every year again, but you know, usually we just get the information. We're not really rehired. We're just expected to be there. And I never heard anything. So I reached out to the lead TA, and she never responded. So I reached out to the other lady in charge, and she was like, well, you just stopped coming to camp last year and you didn't tell us why. Like, of course we're not going to hire you again. It's like, I spoke to the lead TA, and she handled my situation. She said she talked to you, that my accommodations were set in place. I communicated with her, and I was leaving. Like, this was all like set up. Like, what are you talking about? And she was like, I was never made aware of your situation. And that was it. And she's like, so sorry. And she's like, that looks really bad on you. We don't want you working at the camp. But when she first answered that email, she said that they'd had numerous issues with me. And that's where I was like, I remember responding back, and I'm like, can you let me know what I did? I'm like, what were the issues? And there were not numerous issues. It was this one thing. She had nothing else to say. I always like put my heart and soul into that camp, because that was like the first camp I really did. How was this happening? The betrayal was so just powerful. There was this girl that came to me. I didn't even really know her. I talked to her like twice at school, and she took the role that my best friend should have taken. She made the petition to remove him from the school during the investigation. She sent it to faculty, to students, social media. She was setting up protests. She put together like a list of emails for the school for people that wanted to email on behalf of me and be like, get this man out of here. Do not make her have to walk back into that school while he's there. Not telling them to fire him, but there should be safety measures put in place. And I decided like, okay, I need to get this restraining order. So it was my first time going to the courthouse. I had gone to the police station first, and he explained what I needed to do and where I needed to go. It is horrible. It is horrific there. All the workers, all the people there. And the entire time I was there, I was in tears because of my situation and because how scared I was to be there. But then I had these people talking down to me, and they're just watching me like tears and just like whatever, and saying whatever they want and being extremely rude. While I was there, I learned that I couldn't get a restraining order. That's not for situations like what happened in the office. Restraining orders are only for partnerships. So like domestic abuse, I guess would be an example. But they said you can get a no contact order though. And I was like, okay, well, what's the difference? Basically, he wouldn't be allowed to speak to me, but he could stand right next to me. He can still touch me, have his shoulder up against me. He can walk next to me. He just can't speak to me. That was just wild to me, because it was a measure of safety. These are safety measures that we were trying to get put in place. I'm like, well, what good is this really going to do? It's a piece of paper that is telling him to not talk to me. And even if he does, where's the evidence going to be? So I knew that wouldn't really do much for me, but I was like, well, I have to take every measure I can. I had to fill out a piece of paper, and I had to write his name, his address, his birthday, like features about him. And then there's a few lines. I should have counted how many lines. There's a few lines on the piece of paper to write down what happened to you. 2 years. I'm like, okay. And I think like the stuff that I wrote down like were so vague. And I filled up all the lines, and I was like, there is more. I was granted in total, it was like 2 or 3 emergency contact orders. What they do with the no contact order is they have to serve it to him. And all he has to do is not answer the door when they try to serve him. And he didn't answer the door. So they tried to serve him like relentlessly. The police were getting so frustrated. And so that's what they kept doing, is just granting emergency no contact orders again and again. And I had to keep going back to the courthouse. And I had to keep, when you go to the courthouse too, it's not just for your court. You see other people's courts too before yours. It just depends on the order they call you up. And I was always fearful when I went there that he would show up. And he never did. They told me like, we'll grant this many emergency no contact orders, and then eventually you can sign for publication. So you sign a piece of paper, and it's granted a year-long no contact order. And I was like, oh, okay. So I just had to keep waiting, keep going back to the courthouse, keep getting these emergency ones until they would grant me. So I was waiting. I had mentioned before that I was in the group chat. I shared the petition on that group chat. There were lots of women it was solely women in that group chat, and they like responded very kindly. They're like, oh, like, so sorry to hear this happened to you. Yes, we'll absolutely sign it. So days later, they sent a message saying, hey, I hope you don't mind. We just have some questions about your situation. And I was, at that point, I was like, okay, like, understandable. Like, I'll answer any questions. I wanted to be as open as possible. They asked if I could send the pictures that he sent me. They said they wanted to see what a 50, 60-year-old looked like. And I responded back, and I was like, I felt so bad because I didn't want to like say no, but I was like, I can't. Like, that's illegal.
But who asks for that? That's crazy.
And these were women like somewhere in their 20s and then 40s and 50s. Like, there were multiple women that were like, I don't know, conspired together. We're like, let's ask. And when I said no then and explained that it was illegal to do that, they asked if I could describe what his thing looked like to them. They're like, was it shaved?
Why?
Was it circumcised? How thick was it? What did it taste like? What did it feel like? They asked all those questions. And I was I was so in shock that I was like trying to answer their question. I wasn't even thinking like why they want to know this, but I was like, I guess if they're going to support me, okay. And eventually the questions, they got worse and worse and worse. And one even said like, oh, well, you're probably not going to be able to do anything with this because my husband raped me, and police won't do anything if it's your husband. And especially since you went back in his office again after it happened, like, why'd you do that? I left the chat, and after I did that and I had started to cool myself down, I got a private message from one of the other girls that was in the chat that was closer to my age, and she apologized for upsetting me and then continued to ask those questions, what it looked like. And I had to block her individually. And then that stopped. That part was done. But those victim blaming comments also happened a lot on the Instagram page with the story. And people just, they live in their own little worlds. And I saw a comment that said, how did you not have the talk by age 19? And they just didn't understand of how I grew up, that wasn't a thing. And all I did was practice my instrument. I guess other people were having sex all the time and had the talk, and like all of us had all this proper education. That's not culturally how I grew up. And the one that sometimes still rings in my head is, you make sexual assault victims look bad. And I didn't even know that was possible for a victim to make other victims look bad. I don't think
they don't. It's not. It's just something assholes say.
I knew for Title IX, eventually the process, it's almost like a court thing that they do then to decide after the investigation, 90 to 120 days. So I knew I needed a lawyer for that. The school could grant you one, but did I really want the school giving me a lawyer? When technically it's the school, they were in fault as well. This happened on their grounds, and they were liable. So I knew I had to get my own. And I was on my way to meet with one for the very first time. And I got into my first car accident on my way to the lawyer's office. It wasn't my fault, I can say that. I stopped at my stoplight, and just a car came flying back like behind me. Didn't see that we'd stopped and slammed into me. Luckily, I was far enough from the car in front of me, so nothing was my fault, and he had to pay for everything. But the guy, I could see him. His car was like on top of mine in the back, and I could see he was like screaming and hitting and throwing stuff in his car. And it reminded me of the professor in his office, because he would act the exact same way. And I started hyperventilating in the car. And I remember like checking to make sure my doors were locked. And like, I didn't even know who to call. I didn't think to me, like, I have to call 911. I called 911, and it was funny. The guy was like, are you going north or south? And I was like, I don't know. And he had to try to like direct me. I couldn't think straight. The trauma had just happened. Right. I could not think, and he had to direct me to answer the questions. That lawyer, though, he, I called him and stuff, and I told him what happened. He was very kind, but then he never got back to me. I started looking into another lawyer. I didn't even know that there were multiple kinds of lawyers. I was contacting, like, for a few weeks, criminal defense attorneys. The one was like a property lawyer or something. Like, I was contacting, I didn't realize I needed a personal injury lawyer. Like, that's what I should have contacted. Like, I just thought lawyers are lawyers. How would I know? Like, when was I supposed to learn that there were different? Or the
difference between like criminal and civil. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know what that meant either. And that hadn't even been brought up yet. So I was just like, I don't know what's going on. Then we reach August 15th, 22 days after I shared my story. I was in a virtual therapy session, and a little email popped up. and it was from my school. It just said, I previously sent a communication to the community about allegations against a faculty member. Since that time, the faculty member has separated from the university and is no longer employed by the university. So I was like, oh my God, he quit. Because for Title IX, there were only 3 things to do that would shut down, like there wouldn't be an investigation. Either you didn't have enough evidence was 1. 2 is if like one person left the school. And then the 3rd one, I don't remember, but there were 3 things. And that was the only thing he could control, was by leaving the school. And then he left behind everything. And my therapist was like, wow, okay, well, how do you feel? And I like sat there and I was like, the feeling came to me so quick. And I'm like, I am so mad. And she's like, yeah. I'm like, no, I'm mad. He shut everything. I've been compiling all this evidence. I wrote everything out that happened to me. I was doing everything I had to do, going to lawyers. I had to miss part of this music camp. He just quit and he steps away from it. I also just realized like the level of protection he had as a tenured faculty member, the level of protection he had by having a wife, by having kids, because everybody was concerned about the family. Everybody was concerned about his career since he'd had it for so long. No one cared about me. I didn't have a partner. How could I with what was happening to me? I didn't have children. So even with the professor's admission to what he did, they still wanted to put him on this wait of 90 to 120 days investigation trial, whatever, before they were going to fire him, and letting him continue working there with students and giving him the chance to quit. And I think, Claire, you've said this before too, we definitely suspect there was a communication that happened between him and the school, and that they said, you should quit, because the school doesn't want to have to deal with their reputation and the possible protests and everybody being mad that he's allowed there. He had confided in me how much he hated working there because he was going to be the only faculty member in that department because the others had just retired. And he was so flustered. He's like, I wish I could just quit and work somewhere else, but I can't because I have a family. And so I was like, well, I'm just thinking of all the ways he won. I had a message from somebody that was family with him. She had also gone to school there with me, but we hadn't gotten super close. Again, I was really isolated, but she was only there for like a year when I was there. So we didn't really have time to get to know each other. And her responses, she said that she was sorry for everything going on, but she also said it seemed like I didn't want to be around anybody. And she even thought I hated her because of the way I was in school, I guess, not talking to people enough. And the one comment I won't forget is saying, not to defend anyone, but the wife is a victim too. She was mean to you because she knew this was happening. The abuse that the wife put me through cannot be justified.
No.
That is not, because you're going through a trauma doesn't make it okay to traumatize somebody else. And I will always feel a lot of pain around there because I considered the wife a close friend, and the fact that she enabled this to happen to protect her and protect anyone else.
Yeah.
I think that the professor was right when he brought up the term accomplice himself.
Whatever trauma she has or whatever mistreatment, that's not your responsibility. She's got her own story, but that doesn't erase what she did to you. And that's not your business. And I don't mean that in a like, you shouldn't think about it way. I mean, that's not your responsibility. It's not your job to feel sympathy for somebody who also abused you just because they may have had their own trauma that led them to that place. That's ridiculous.
Exactly. Yeah. And then I also got messages from 2 former female students, and they just attacked me like crazy through DM and wanted me to stay quiet. And it was for his family's sake is what they were concerned about. One of them said, you got what you wanted. He quit. And I remember just being like, I got what I wanted. Did I want any of this? I wanted none of this to happen. If I lived in an ideal world, I would have wanted him to be fired and in jail.
Yeah.
Or just that he never even had the speeding ground to let the office stuff happen in the first place. That shouldn't have even been possible to happen, but the environment was set up where that was possible to happen. One of them had sent the messages while at church with his family on a Sunday. And that's considered a third-party violation of the no contact order. So I went to the police and I asked, I'm like, what do I do? Like, is this allowed? Can they harass me like this? And they did file a report for it. But that's when I found out that he still hadn't been served the original contact order. He was still avoiding it. So he couldn't be arrested or nothing could be done about it. They could file it, but until the paper is in his hands, they can do whatever they want to me. This situation, it did spark a new fight into me. I had worked on getting new lawyers. They put multiple lawyers on your case. So I had like 3 lawyers on my case. And I decided, since the school now was no longer doing anything and this harassment could just continue, I'm going to pursue it in the justice system legally, whatever that meant, because I didn't really understand anything. And like Claire said, that's what I'm figuring out. Okay, what's a criminal thing? What's a civil thing? I didn't understand that there were these different like terms and stuff. So I'm learning about all those things. It feels so weird to talk about because I had to keep this quiet for so long, but they wanted to pursue things civilly because we had a better chance. That criminally, I mean, even my lawyers knew, the police knew, the lawyers knew, like, no one gets served like criminally. No one actually gets in jail for this. And if they do, they get in jail for like one night. Even if you have his admission, it's still not going to get you anywhere and they'll attack
really
you.
hard, yeah.
So let's go civilly. That's easier. Okay. I'm like, yeah, he took a lot of money from me. I wasn't able to work. I was so sick. Like I missed so many opportunities. My career is ruined. My health is ruined. So that makes sense. I never thought about it, but I'm like, yeah, that's justice. Okay, let's do it. So I had to move back into the same apartment complex that I was in that year prior while everything was happening. It was kind of like creepy being back there. But now my windows were facing the school, right there by the school, and then also facing a certain direction where he lived, like the direction of where he lived from my windows. And that's all I could think about. Like he's so much closer. And I remember that whole day as I was moving in, I was so mean to all of the workers there, just so irritable. Finally, when I was like in my place alone, I just broke down, like heaving, sobbing. I went on an Instagram live because I felt like I didn't have anyone to talk to. And I just like talked to people on live and everyone was like super, super supportive. I still had a year and a semester left to get my double degree and music education degrees. We'll get into it later, but it's so complicated, any degree really, to like transfer or leave your school. So I felt like I had,
especially in music, it's like physically impossible.
Yeah. So my very first day for my senior year back at school, I had a violin lesson that morning and my teacher was incredible. She knew of everything that was going on. Everybody knew of everything that was going on. And she called me the day before and she wanted to make sure I was doing okay, for one. And she's like, if you need to cancel like right before, it's fine. We'll make it work. We'll figure it out. I walked in the school and she was standing there and she was waiting for me. And she went to go walk with me. And when she was walking with me, I was like, oh my God, she's going to take the normal route. And taking the quickest normal route is past his office. And I remember I was starting to panic and I was in the elevator with her in my head. I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't want to walk past his office. I was going to go, it's not his office anymore, but it's the office.
Right.
Like, I don't want to go there. And I started to panic and I felt like I couldn't say anything, but no, she knew. She took the longer route and made sure we did not have to go past the old office. She walks in first, I walk in after her and get my stuff like set up and I have my violin there. And she asked me if I could close the door behind me because it was still open. And I was like, oh yeah, because we're having a lesson. So I go to close the door and like my eyes, I just like fixated on the locks on the door. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the same door that was in his office. I mean, it's on the same floor as his office. His office was only a few doors down, but I'm like, this is the door with the locks on it. And I remember having like this little flashback where I was thinking about him like fighting with the door, trying to get the locks to close. And he was getting so flustered. Like, and I was trying to like keep myself composed like during the lesson. But then I was looking and I see like a chair in her office. And I'm like, oh my God, that's the chair that he has in his office that I used to sit in. And I'm looking down and I'm like, oh my God, that's the same color carpet. Yeah, that's in his office too. And just like, oh my God, the dizziness and just the terror. It was, my body was just, it could not relax. Somehow I got my voice at the end of the lesson. I was so awkward about it. And I was like, can I just like ask something? It's like, you know, if you ever need the door to be closed again, can you just do it and not ask me, because you have the same door that he has on. So I didn't have to say his name. I'm like, that he has on his door. And it's really triggering for me to look at the door. And her face, she's like, oh, I am so sorry. And she was very like kind about it. She's like, you'll never have to close it again. Thank you for letting me know.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was very lucky that I had her support. She was very, very kind and respectful to my situation. I think too, in some ways she felt some guilt because she was my violin teacher. She said to me too, she's like, I'm a mother and I can't believe I missed this. I knew you weren't doing well last semester. I knew you were sick all the time. And I saw you were not looking healthy or okay. And I I thought you just had stomach issues. And she was just in shock.
I was going to say, because I've seen comments about this, about being like, why are there locks? This is I'm not going to say what the building was, but it's a historic building that was repurposed from a kind of building where it would be extremely normal and required to have locks on the door, and they have not replaced those doors. So that is why, and they're also old, so that's why like they're fumbling with them mechanically and everything. So if anyone's going, why are there locks at a school? That's why, because it's a repurposed building.
Yep. And it just totally fosters abuse there. And they didn't even care to think to it. And there's no windows on the doors, as we probably talked about before. That very night, on the Rate My Professors, whatever it's called, website, there were multiple comments on his Rate My Professors page saying about how respectful and how helpful he was. My God, we're talking about what he did to me. Respectful, it was like the worst words you could use. And they were all new. Since my story had come out, it showed when they were published. And so immediately I'm like, oh my God, like who's commenting this in support of him? Eventually, I guess I could say that Claire emailed the website, and because if he doesn't work there anymore, I didn't even know the site, it can be taken down. So emailed the site and explained, and they're like, okay, we'll take it down since he's no longer working there.
So I did email them, and I was like, okay, well, if you won't let us acknowledge that, because I was trying to leave, and a lot of people were trying to leave negative things, but like they would get taken down because they were being like framed as like, oh, this is spam or harassment. So then I was like, okay, well, if you're not going to let us put up negative reviews, then at least he doesn't work there. So take his profile down.
Right. And they did. So that was helpful because I didn't have to see that anymore. Yeah. And it was really hard to see those comments. No one was really denying what happened. Just to point that out. Nobody really, I mean, there were some people that said it, but the vast majority weren't saying, I don't believe you, because I had all of the evidence. They couldn't say that. It was just the fact that they didn't want me speaking out, and he was protected. So I was putting up with, around this time then, fake Instagram accounts, harassing DMs, harassing comments, just constantly. And I couldn't go private, because how do you monetize or market yourself as a musician if you go private on especially my social media platform? I couldn't really do that. It was like a last resort I kept in the back of my head, but I was trying to put up with it as best as I could. But that was going on all the time while I was in school. Let's talk about something positive. This girl means the world to me who did this for me. I'm not going to say her name, but she knows who she is. I had talked about wanting to dye my hair red, like the Sasha red, on my Instagram before. And she commented back to me and she's like, hey, like, I would love to do this for you. Like, this is the kind that I use. We can do it together. And I was like, oh my God. She's like an amazing violinist. Like, she's an incredible violinist. And I was just like, she wants to hang out with me. To go there, I had to take the same train that I would take to go to church, to the professor's place. And I looked down and my eyes immediately landed on an umbrella that someone was holding. And it was like this blue diamond, kind of like rhombusy umbrella. If you were to have asked me before then, what umbrella did the professor have? I could never have told you. Right. But when I saw it, I was like, oh my God. And my brain went right back and I remembered little snippets. It's like, I don't remember things perfectly like storyline wise, but I remembered a little snippet of him knocking over his umbrella when he was trying to grab me. And I just remember it hitting the floor and him like completely ignoring it. And I started to cry on the train and just, I felt so like defeated and so weak. Like I couldn't do anything. It was following me around everywhere that I went, but I somehow made it to her place. She never once brought him up. Didn't bring up the situation at all. I thought we would be dyeing our hair together. No, she was just doing my hair. She did it for me and just completely like pampered me, had the chair all like set up and stuff. She turned on One Direction. Oh my God, it was so funny. Cause like I love listening back to like old music like that from when I was like younger. And we just like chatted about like girl stuff on my way back then, because I had to take the train back and going back and feeling really awesome with my new hair. As I was walking back, I just realized like how long it had been since someone had been nice to me, especially since my story had gotten out. And, you know, I didn't really believe in God anymore after everything that the professor had done. But I remember walking back to my place and like looking up at the sky and I was like, oh God, just please bless her for everything she's done. There was a professor that had retired partway during the abuse. And I had reached out to her because I had some questions on some projects that I was doing. And she wanted to schedule a Zoom meeting to talk about it. So we did. And I was kind of wondering, I'm like, does she know like everything that happened? She doesn't work there anymore. Like I wondered if she knew. And I knew right away based on the way that she talked to me. And she was just like, Emily, hello. How are you doing? And I knew
Yeah.
by that tone, I was like, she knows.
Mhm.
And I was just like, I'm good, I'm fine. Like pretending everything's fine. But then towards the end of the call, I had to bring it up. I was like, do you know about everything going on? I think I said something like that. And she's like, I knew since everything came out. And she said, like, I shed tears for you. And she encouraged me to keep speaking out and to do advocacy work going forward. And she said that I would go very, very far. And I told her about what two of the other female students, I didn't call them out, but I told her that there were two female students, like what they had done and how they were talking to me. I'll never forget her response where she's like, you can't worry about people that are stupid. I always tell my kids to consider the source. And I still remember exactly what she said, saying, it's a tough blow, kiddo, but you're a pretty tough nut. So I have no concerns about how you're going to do. And she told me that I was very brave and that she admired me. And I was like, what? And I'm like, I don't feel brave. I think that's all I said. And she's like, yeah, but bravery means the ability to forge ahead no matter what. And I was like, wow, yeah. I mean, I'm here. I'm back on campus. My abuser's not. I'm continuing both of my degrees. I'm trying to heal. I was already working on other projects and stuff that I was going to be doing. I had my first meeting with the attorneys. I was in this like huge fancy building. And when I got up to the front desk, the lady, I remember, she's like, okay, would you like coffee, tea, water, like making it all safe? And I was just like, in my head, I'm thinking, I don't deserve anything. I'm like, I have water, thank you. I was also like mentally getting ready because I knew I'd have to speak through everything as much as I could remember to them. I already sent them like all the evidence and everything I had written down, but I figured we're still going to have to talk about things in some detail. I was very happy that when they walked into the room, there was one man, it was two women that would be handling my case. And at the time, I'd really gotten into criminal minds. And they both looked just like Emily Prentice and JJ. And they were so incredibly kind during the meeting. They were so human too. And when I was talking through all of the stuff that he did, all the stuff that he had said about other girls, one of them had mentioned, oh, what a creep, to the stuff that he had done and said. And just seeing their like humanness for being so like, lawyers are like all like perfect. And it was just, it was a good match. I felt safe. And yeah, they explained that, yes, we are definitely going to pursue this civilly, both against him, and they wanted to pursue it against the school. And at the time, I hadn't really realized, I felt like all I had left was the school. So I wanted to believe that they had my back, even though I had already realized that they did not care about me at all. They explained that the school was very much so liable for what had happened to me, and they wanted to go after them too. And I was like, okay, you guys know best. They had asked times about the school, like the time where I had left his office crying, the time where two knocked on the door and saw me crying in there and didn't do anything. They knew the door was locked with me in there, and they were liable for that. So when they explained this to me, I was like, yeah. And then I remember leaving there and I was like, oh man, the school really doesn't have my back. And I remember how scared I was to have to go back. And I had to lie to one of my professors because I had to miss class to go to this meeting. And I was like, I have a doctor appointment. My homework from that meeting was to reach out to 3 possible witnesses, which were 3 male professors after we talked about the whole situation. So professor number 1, I reached out to professor number 1 and I was like, hi, like I need to talk to you about some stuff. If you'd be available for a phone call, let me know. And I remember saying like, I'm teaching this evening, but if that time works for you, I'll make it work for me. And so it was right in the middle of my teaching. I had to take this call and I explained the situation. And I was like, I just need to know if there were any other situations aside from me that you know of. And I remember at the beginning of his response, he's like, Emily, I no longer work there because he didn't work there anymore, but I'll always be a part of the school or a member of the faculty. And I was like, this is not going well. I already know like this is not going to go well. And he's like, well, we have the stuff set in place. Like if something happens, you report it. So he's like, with respect to this professor, nope, it would be reported if he did anything. And I tried explaining. I was like, well, like just like me, I took time to report. Not everybody reports because it ruins our reputations. He was just like, yeah, sorry, I don't know anything. And so I tried to like pretend like it didn't hurt. And I was like, well, let me know if you think of anything will be helpful. I appreciate it. And he was like, all right, bye, and hung up. And I couldn't teach the rest of the night. I just cried myself to sleep because I lost another person. And this was a person that helped me with one of my research projects too. And so I had really looked up to him. I thought that he was a safe man. I even saw him as a possible letter of recommendation one day. And he wasn't going to help me when I needed help. they had been friends. That was the complicated nature of this, right? Everybody knows everybody, and professor number one and the professor that abused me, they'd been friends for years. Professor number two. This professor, when I had first came back to school, he pulled me over in the hall and he actually apologized for what had happened and said that he'd seen some suspicious things. And he said he didn't even know that like the school wasn't investigating anymore, but he's like, I'd be happy to speak on it if you need me to. And I remembered that. So I was like, well, okay, like then hopefully he should be a good one to go to. And we had a conversation over the phone, and he said, he didn't tell me exactly what he had seen, because he was like, wait, let me make sure that like I can talk to you. We talked over the phone. Like, let me make sure I can speak about this to you. And then yes, if they say it's okay, I'd be more than happy to help. And I asked for him, I'm like, okay, well, can you at least make sure you don't tell the school that I'm pursuing legal action? And he agreed. And I got an email days later from him tagging HR that said, I can't help with your case or speak to your attorneys. And I was like, dude, we just talked about this. And I went to him later, actually. I went to his office. And at the time, they were making sure like doors had to stay open. And I went to him and I was like, okay, we talked about this. Why did you put that in writing and tell HR that I was pursuing a case and I had attorneys? And he laughed at me and he said I should have expected that. And he kept going. And he was like, I'm not on the professor's side and I'm not on your side. And I'm like, there's sides?
Oh,
like,
what? Yeah, seriously.
Yeah. And I started tearing up in his office, and in my head, I'm like, he's not a good person. And I started to put my coat on. He just kind of watched me as I started to like silently cry, like tears were falling. Okay. And I remember after this, I went to my therapist. Why didn't I like yell at him? Why didn't I say you did this wrong? Why didn't I do that? And she's like, well, I'm like, sometimes when you're so respectful like that, I bet he's questioning about what he did. And I bet that he feels bad about everything that he just said to you. Because if you would have gotten angry back, then that would have gotten a reaction out of you. But seeing how you remained so calm and composed, sometimes that's the better reaction to have. Yeah. I did not have that reaction when I went to professor number three. This is building, right? All of this tension, all this pain, this is building. Professor number three was close friends with the professor. I was told by my team to reach out to him. So I asked for a call from him over Facebook Messenger. He no longer worked at the school. I didn't want to go through a school email, obviously asking to talk. He responded back and he's like, sure, okay, like later. Like I have a lot going on right now, but later. And he asked if that was okay. And I'm like, yeah, it's like as soon as you can, I will make it work. Sounds good. And then he went to school email and I got an email from him and he asked, can I know why you want to have this conversation with me? And why did you go to the school email and why are you asking what I want to talk about? And I said, it's personal, hence the call, and hence why I didn't just ask over email questions I have to ask. And he just said that, no, I have to know before I go on for this call. And then I responded back and I was like, I think you already know because you're acting a little strange. And he had actually, when my story first gotten out, he had followed Instagram page where my story was, and then he immediately unfollowed it. So I was aware that he knew about the story. So I'm like, I saw that. So I know that you know about what's going on. And he responded back about him having an attorney and to not contact him about the professor. And that's where I had just lost it. And I emailed back. I said something like, the professor used to make me say the F word, even though I didn't want to and I didn't like swearing. And he made me say it in a sexual way and he said I had to. But now I'm making the decision to swear without anybody forcing me. You're an a-hole. I said the word over in the email. So that you're an a-hole. And the reason that people like off themselves after this. And then after this, I was so broken down. I was so mad that the school had created this rule, not even told me that it wasn't allowed to be spoken about. And I went to school, which was very close to my apartment. And I walked straight into the dean's office and I was sobbing. And I was like, why are you allowing the faculty to treat me this way? And that man, his face, he just stayed calm the entire time. And he sent me to further up deans. I can't give any further information. These people already sent me to further up deans. And they started laughing at me during the meeting. And they made fun of me for being upset. There were two deans at that table, and then it was me. And I had brought up about what had just happened with professor number three, and they just thought it was silly. And yes, I think there shouldn't be harassment, but I'm literally still getting harassment and I can't get any help that because of this rule. And they're like, what rule? Or it was policy, I think it was like, what policy? And I'm like, I heard that you sent an email out to all the faculty and you said that you cannot talk to me about any of this, that you can't talk about it at all. On school grounds, I think was the thing. And they're like, oh, an email's not a policy. And they like burst out laughing. And I was like, is this real life right now? I said, I want to leave. And like, well, you have to wait a couple more minutes because we're going to give you a piece of paper of like support thing, like numbers and stuff to call. And I'm like waiting to leave. And then finally they let me leave. I went back into my place. I laid down for an hour. And then finally it was time for therapy. And then all of a sudden I got a knock on my door, opened the door, and it was a bunch of police officers and like ambulance workers and like a stretcher and all this stuff. And they're like, yeah, so we got 2 complaints at the school. They said that there were 2 people that said that they were concerned about me. And so I'm like, okay, well, one is professor number 3. It's because that email, I showed them the email and I explained that. And they're like, oh, okay, you're fine, whatever. And they're like, do you know who the second one was from? And I'm like, no. And I'm like, there's a second person. And I'm guessing it was the other deans. And I'm like, I have no idea. And I explained what had happened that day. And I'm like, what else? And they're like, well, like, we have to take you to the hospital and have to get you evaluated to make sure that you're not going to hurt yourself. And I'm like, I'm about to go into therapy right now. And plus, like all this stuff, it'd been hours since all this was happening. So if I was going to, they really made sure they delayed it because I would have been dead by then if I was doing that. In front of everybody in this place where all university kids live, everybody was watching me have to walk out and go into this ambulance. Before we left though, I was like, can I at least, like, I was so unprepared. I'm like, can I at least put some clothes on? Like I had to change like in front of a lady. Like I tried to close my bathroom door, but they wouldn't let me like close it all the way. So I had to like change with somebody looking at me. Very traumatic and upsetting. Then when we had made it to the hospital, they took me into, I've never been into like a psychiatric kind of place before. And I was looking around, it was this very small like space. And there was a guy that was in some room and he was banging his head against the glass. And I was like, and just, he was staring at me while he was doing it. And all of this was just freaking, I'm already terrified of men at this point, right? And this is starting to freak me out. And then they go to hand me a gown to change into, and they said I have to take all of my clothes and change into this in front of somebody. And that's where I lost it. And I was like, no, I'm not taking my clothes off. I'm not changing into this. Luckily, there was one like woman there who was younger and she was very, very nice. And she was like, okay, we'll make it work. We won't make you change. And then I relaxed and I was like, okay. It took about an hour. They had to bring some doctor in and he asked what was going on. And I explained again everything that had happened. And he thought it was really stupid. And he let me go. He's like, okay, this is dumb. I'm so sorry. And I'm like, thank you. Then I had no way home.
Did you not have your wallet with you? I'm trying to remember how that, because you went so quick.
I had my phone. And I had my student card. I had no money, nothing on me. And that was before I knew anything about having like an Uber app or anything like that.
Yeah, because I remember messaging you. Yeah.
After that, then I got stuff for safety in case the school was going to do that to me again. And my therapist actually had to call me an Uber because I was walking in the pouring rain. I had an hour to walk in the city to get back. And I was wearing pajama shorts. And I think I had a sweatshirt on, but it was still very cold and raining. And I had just gotten my hair dyed and there was red pouring down my face. All the dye was coming out. Finally made it back to my apartment place and I went to scan to go in. My ID wasn't working. It was evening time by this point. I missed all my students. I missed therapy. My students, I get paid for teaching and I was losing more money because I couldn't teach now because they took me away. And I'm like, why isn't this working? My ID's not working there. And they're like, oh, let me look. I'm like, oh, can you step to the side for a second? I'm like, oh my God. And so I had to stand, I swear it was like 10 minutes. I had to stand there dripping wet, waiting. And then someone comes up to me and they're like, yeah, so we just flagged your ID and because we have to ask you after you come back from something like this, are you okay? And I was like,
no.
Yeah, I'm like, yes, I'm fine. And in my head, I'm like, no. I'm like, you just put me through this horrible trauma. And no, I was able to go back into my apartment and I put stuff up against the door. I remember because I was so afraid of somebody coming back in for me. And that was where I had like constant, that used to be my safe place was my apartment. Nobody else lived there. It was just me. And then I was constantly scared of somebody coming into my room. And I didn't talk to anybody for a week after this. I think Claire remembers that. I didn't talk to Claire for a week either. And you were like really one of the only few people I had. I was posting on Instagram, but I didn't.
You weren't interacting.
Yeah, I wasn't like talking to anyone. And I don't know what got me to start talking to people again. So after trying all this time to get a no contact order. Finally, they're like, okay, well, we've tried to serve him this many times and he hasn't answered and we can't find him. So now you get to sign for publication. I was like, okay, what does that mean? I'm like, what exactly do I have to do? And they're like, well, all you got to do is you have to come in person to sign this, and then you'll be granted a year-long no contact order. And I was like, that's it? Like, why don't we just start with that? I mean, like, obviously they have to serve him, but I'm like, wow, okay, cool. So I had to miss classes again to come in and all the way to this faraway courthouse to sign it. But I did. This was very important to me. And I remember signing it, and they're like, all right, all you gotta do is sign down here, and then you are all set and good to go, and it will be in publication. And I felt a little bit of freedom that day. But the story never ends well. A few weeks later, a card came in the mail, and it was on a Friday that this came. So then the weekend was coming up, and it said his name versus my name. So that's as if he was getting a no contact order against me, or he was claiming I did something to him. It should be my name versus him. And I went to my attorneys and I was like, what is this? And it said something was dismissed for prosecute. What was that? It was like dismissed of prosecution or something. It was these fancy words. And I was like, what? And I'm like, so wait, like, is he pursuing something against me? Or did you dismiss him? Or like, what's going on? Like, I didn't understand why I got that. And my attorneys were like, this makes no sense. Did he file against you? Because why is his name first? And I'm like, I don't know. And they're like, okay, well, we'll have to wait until Monday. And then you can like call and try to like figure this out. The following week, then I had called the courthouse, and they said that he showed up to our court date 2 or 3 weeks ago with an attorney and got my no contact order dismissed. And I was like, when was this court date? And they said the date. And I'm like, weren't you supposed to tell me I had a court date? Yeah. And they're like, yeah, I guess like you should have been told that. And I'm like, I was told that I signed for publication and that was it. I was never given a court date. I was told that was all I had to do. And now it was up for a year and I would be safe for a year. And they're like, yeah, well, sorry. And like, I don't know. Sometimes this just happens. And they had nothing really to say. And I'm like, well, there's nothing I can do. And they're like, well, the court date was already like 2 or 3 weeks ago. Technically, if you miss a court date, you have to contact them at most a couple days after. I'm like, well, how could I have contacted you? And I had no idea there was a court date. They told me, okay, well, if he contacts you again, you need to have evidence that he contacts you again. And then you can come to us with it. And then we can start this process all over again. I was like, what? And so, I mean, I was getting so many comments like from fake Instagram accounts that just kept coming and coming that I highly still suspect are him or are those other female students or his family, just because of the details of stuff that they know. I'm like, okay, well, this is coming from somebody who knows the situation well. I looked up his attorney and said that he was known for his aggressive cross-examination techniques for getting many sexual assault cases dropped. I am of the mindset that I really don't think anybody lies about this stuff. Yeah, I'm sure there's documented times of people that have lied for whatever reasons, but really, and if you're going through all the suffering and pain to go to court, to get lawyers, think about all the stuff I already mentioned. And we haven't even filed a complaint formally yet. And all the stuff I've already had to go through by speaking up. Like, no one goes through all of this just for fun. There's no fun involved in it. I was so defeated and broken down by this. I had posted on Instagram, I remember saying that sexual assault is worse than murder, and I would rather be murdered. I'd rather be dead by him than alive, dealing with the aftermath of this. Just bringing awareness to like what it's like being a survivor and speaking out that nobody wants to hear, but it's just reality. It's the truth. And someone reported it to the school. We never figured out who that one was, right?
No. And I was digging.
At my door, actually, there was a knock, and it was just one person, and it was like a student there that like worked there, and he was like, hey, like, I just want to let you know, like, there's going to be an ambulance coming for you. Like, there was a report made to the school, and like the school already called an ambulance, but I wanted to let you know in advance. I'm like, this just happened a couple weeks ago. And he's like, yeah, this sounds like harassment. That's why I wanted to come here first and let you know so you had time. And he's like, you probably have like 10 minutes. I just want to let you know. And I was like, thank you. Someone had my back, and he felt so bad.
They won't let you leave, right? Like they wouldn't,
right. Otherwise I totally would have.
Because you were texting me in real time. I remember I felt so bad that the first time this happened, I didn't see it until after you were walking home. And then I didn't hear from you. This time I had just gotten out of a doctor appointment while this happened. And I was on my phone and I look and you're like, they're here, they're guarding my door, they won't let me go. And I was like, okay, what do we do?
I had time to like pack a tiny bag to email my lawyers and call people for help. But ultimately, the school has more power than all of those things. There was a female officer who blamed me for what happened. She was left alone with me then in the ambulance, and she was blaming me, saying I didn't do enough. And now I was extremely messed up for posting something like that. And she called me sick in the head and was cracking jokes the entire ambulance ride, saying, into the psych ward you go. And I remember one specific, I was trying not to forget everything because I wanted to make sure I remembered everything as best as I could. And her saying, you need something, but I don't know what, but you need something. And then when we had arrived finally to the place, and she forced me to get into a wheelchair once we got there. I said I was not allowed to walk. So I just sit into a wheelchair. And in the wheelchair, it's just so disgusting. It's like your legs have to be like spread in the wheelchair. So I like scooted to like one side, for my feet to be able to rest on there. So I didn't have to be so like exposed and stuff. Once again, I was supposed to teach that night, right? And now I'm being taken to a hospital. For the first ambulance situation, that costed $3,000 for that harassment. This one, I was assuming was going to be $3,000 on top of it. But this time they took me to a different hospital, so I had no idea. I asked the school to cover it for me since they'd forced me to go, and they ended up never doing that. But while I'm there, then they put me into a small room and they forced me to undress completely with two people. So already the power dynamic, there's two people that are in positions of power there, but two people over me. And I kept saying, no, I'm not changing. I'm not changing. And they said I had to. I had no choice. I had a panic attack during it. And they were touching me and like lifting my arms and like were looking at my chest and stuff too. I did have scars there from when I was hurting myself on my chest. And then they put me in a really large room with, I would guess, like 15 other patients around there. There was one that was throwing up everywhere. I have issues with that. There was no soap. You couldn't wash your hands with soap. You couldn't eat there. You could just have water. My phone had lost its battery because I wasn't prepared enough for this. So you can't charge there because you can't have like cords. Like they could charge it up for you at the front if you bring a cord. So eventually got a cord. I was taken at 5 p.m. around that time. And I didn't get out until around 4 a.m.
4 a.m. Yeah.
And they had me speak with a doctor again to like make sure I was okay. And again, she immediately let me go. They're like, this is stupid. We have serious things to deal with here. And they're forcing you to come here. There's one girl that was next to me. I witnessed it all happening, that the nurses there were making fun of her for being bisexual.
Yeah.
And she'd also opened up about being bipolar, and they were making fun about that as well. And before I'd gotten there, I guess they had restrained her, and she didn't really have anyone else to be there for support for her. And she's like, you had no reason to restrain me. Like I wasn't doing anything. And I believed her wholeheartedly by the way she was talking and the way she was being spoken to. And she'd been there for a few days and they still weren't taking her. I wanted to like stand up for her, and I wanted to be like, shut up. You're not making fun of her for any.
But you got to make yourself look sane.
And if I would have done that, they would have spoken against me. So I had to stay quiet, and I felt so guilty. I still do feel guilty.
Like I was downtown. My husband and I stayed downtown until about 11 p.m. because I thought the first time you were out with like in an hour. So as soon as I heard this was happening, I was like, I'm going to go here and then I'll be there to pick Emily up. I can at least make sure she's safe. And if it's not safe for her to go back to the dorms, we can take her to my place. They were so mean. Like when I went into the waiting room to like inquire about you, they kept telling you like, oh, you're almost done. They were lying to you. And then, when I said like, oh, she'll be out any minute, they laughed at me. They're like, she's not getting out anytime soon. They're like, you should come back in the morning. And so like at 11 p.m. we eventually were like, okay, I guess we have to go home because like I can't sit in a parking lot all night. I felt horrible.
It's like a jail. It really is.
Yeah.
And I think that's what bothered me is I felt like I was being thrown in jail when he should have been the one in jail. My ID was flagged again for multiple days and multiple days too. They just forgotten once they asked, are you okay? And I'm like, I knew the system. I'm like, you work within the system. Yes, I'm fine. Instead of yelling at them, because then I would be sent right back there. So the 2 jobs I had to quit during the abuse, I had thought, I should contact them since this is all public now. And I should let them know really why I had to quit the jobs. I just told them that I was so sick and having health issues, which was not a lie, but she just said about how proud she was that I was speaking out and I was taking care of myself. And so I was like, good, because I was so worried, like she's going to think I just quit jobs, but now she knew the truth. And the other one, was also very kind. And then it was shortly after this that I got a call from my doctor's office, and it was some office lady on the phone. She's like, okay, so we were contacted by attorneys for your records. We need to know what this is for. And I was like, oh, okay. And, I explained, I'm like, well, this happened by a professor and they need my information because we're pursuing this civilly. And the silence on the end of the line was so loud. And she was just like, oh my God. Like, she was in complete shock. It was just like, no one should have to go through that. Nobody should have to go through that. You are on my prayer list. I was like, about to start crying. And I was like, oh my God, like, this is so, like, strangers were treating me better than my own school. That was validation and compassion that I wasn't getting from anywhere else. After the ambulance insanity, I was like, okay, I can't do this anymore. I finally realized, I'm like, I can't, things can't keep going the way that they're going. And I got my double degree plan changed where I could cut off an extra semester. So that meant I only had to be on campus for one more year, so 2 more semesters. And then the 3rd semester is student teaching, so it's off campus. I will not have to keep being there, being triggered. To do that, I had to take, it was well over 18 credit hours in that first semester. But I didn't care. I was like, I have to get out of here as quick as I can. I can't survive this whole year, then have my summer away from here, but knowing I have to come back again in the fall. I can't do that. It meant a lot of extra classes. I had my senior recital that year too.
Yeah. And this was 7 weeks into the semester, wasn't it?
Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I think it was more than that. It was like 8 weeks. It was very, very close. Of course, one of the classes involved me having to go back to the room that the professor taught in. I told the teacher of that class vaguely, right, because I'm not supposed to talk about it, saying, hey, so this room is going to be very triggering for me. I just want to let you know in case I'm like silently crying in the room or I get sick in there or something. This is going to be really hard. And he was very kind. And he right away went to the deans and he's like, we're switching rooms. We're not going to be in this room with her. And he got the room changed. So that was
only person I trust.
I was trying to get into a trauma program because I was not doing okay, but there were no accommodations unless I were to drop one of my degrees, which is what the professor wanted me to do. That was a heck no. Or I leave the school and then will make me stay at the school even longer because I'd have to come back. And I'm like, what is the point? I think I said this. I'm like, what's the point of me going through a trauma program and then having to go right back to the place where all of the trauma happened? I wasn't able to do that. The only thing I could do and afford was therapy. So I tried group therapy and I was in my individual therapy. We weren't supposed to talk about it, but some found their ways to show how they were truly feeling. And I was in a class where we were starting to talk about our final that was coming up and how our final had to be one-on-one in person in his office. And in my head, I'm like, oh crap, I have to go into that man's office. And before I could even fully think that, he's like, and don't worry. And his tone changed. He's like, don't worry, the door has to remain cracked so you all feel safe and secure. Every single eye in that classroom was like side-eyeing me. Couldn't report that to the school and be like, he's mocking me.
I expected better of him. I really did. That was a bummer. Yeah.
No, he was a great teacher, I feel like, for me too. And it was until after everything happened. One of the friends I'd opened up to over the summer about everything asked to call me, and she asked if she could have my advice on something. And honestly, I had heard that she'd just gotten a new like social media marketing like position thing. And I'm like, oh, she's probably asking social media advice. And she had been assaulted again. And this time it was by a doctor. And she told me it was the 10th time. And that now she was finally like, I can't, like, I have to do something. Like, this is the 10th time I've been assaulted. And she was young and it was still happening. And she talked about how impressed she was with the fight I had in me. And she knew I had my team and that we were getting like the complaint ready and together. And she asked me just for what that process was like. And I mean, as soon as I said, yeah, you have to face him, you have to be in the same room as him, and you have to go through cross-examination where they tear you down and find anything wrong with you, and they'll make fun of you for it and say that you don't deserve justice because of something silly. And I mean, I was very honest with her. I worded it in a kind way, but I answered all of her questions and stuff. I remember how mad I was after that phone call. It just happens everywhere. Like, it's probably happening right now as we're recording this podcast. Somebody somewhere is being assaulted. And we're so desensitized to it in the system that enables it and lets everybody get away. One of my friends from way back in high school, we started talking again after my story went public because she also had been assaulted before in her lifetime. Like, we're getting together to catch up. And I was just waiting for her to come by. I was like, oh, there's a really great like smoothie place. That we walked to the smoothie place. I was afraid to be out there because it was on a Saturday, and I was aware that he was down there with one of his children on Saturdays. I didn't leave my apartment on Saturdays, but I had my friend coming here and she was with me. So I was like, okay, this is fine. I remember like once I got in there, I kind of like caught my breath and she's like, I'm so proud of you. This is your neighborhood. You deserve to be able to walk around here on a Saturday. And she was all like uplifting me. I was like, yeah, like I did it. I did it. And we were laughing and I look up and I look at the window and I swear like 2 feet from me outside the window was the wife and one of his children. And I froze and I turned my back quickly. My friend was right there in front of me. And I'm like, that's them, that's them, that's them. And I kept saying it over and over because I felt like she wasn't going to understand me. I looked and I like made sure I wasn't just, going crazy. And I'm like, no, that's them. My friend was like, are you okay? Like your face just went completely pale. Like you look like you're going to be sick. And did I get sick that night? And that next day, I think it was the next day. It was around this time then that I was officially diagnosed with PTSD. When I was meeting with my psychiatrist for the very first time, I actually got sick during the call and I had to like end the call. And I'm like, I'm going to be sick. I have to go. And I got like so sick. She said there was no shadow of a doubt to her that I had all the obvious symptoms and then she'd suspected I'd had it for a little bit because at that time, it had already been like how many months since he last touched me. I went out with one of my friends who is also in the music world. She also had opened up to me about being sexually assaulted herself. And so there was some like closeness in that. We dealt with abuse before and we went out together. We got some lunch, we chatted. We had a teacher in common and she had brought up the fact that he had told her like, oh yeah, Emily was put in the studio that she's in right now, which is the top studio at her school, because they didn't want her to be with the other man that she was put with the first time because he has this history. And she brought it up so casually and I was like, what? Like, what are you talking about? And she's like, yeah, like, isn't that what happens? Like you were originally put in this man's studio and then your current teacher found out and made sure that you were not with him because he has a history. So she wanted to make sure you were protected. And I was like, I didn't know that. I'm like, I was told that she took me out of that studio because she changed her mind and she loved my work ethic and she wanted to work with me. And she's like, oh, I'm sorry, maybe he didn't want you to know, but your teacher told him that the reason why she took you is because she did not want you to have to be alone in a room with him. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, man, my world just came crashing down. For one, there's another professor that has this history. Everybody knows it. Even the teachers know it. And my teacher didn't take me because of my work ethic, which I held like such a strong pride for. I knew I wasn't really talented. I knew I wasn't the best. I just knew I worked hard. And I thought that's why she took me. 2 weeks before my senior recital, I got a phone call from the man that was helping with my case. It has been how long since I had first 6 months-ish, like contacted them over that, and they still haven't filed the complaint. And that's just the beginning of a civil suit. Like, these kind of lawsuits can take like at least 2 years. So they still hadn't filed the complaint. And I was like questioning, I hadn't heard from them in like 2 months. And then I was like, what's going on? And they wouldn't answer my emails. It was this whole communication issue. So I was having a lot of issues with them. And the man calls me and he tells me that they have decided to drop my case. And his reasoning was, we don't have the resources and they wanted me to tell you. But he's like, we'll contact you in a few more weeks.
Always a few more weeks.
Just a few more weeks. And it ends up being months. I wanted to make sure in the phone call that I thoroughly understood why they were doing what they were doing, because I knew this was important. And he said, well, this whole time, they were waiting for more students to send letters to the school saying that they were assaulted by this professor. More victims that want to come forward and want to do the exact same thing that I do means more money. There just wasn't enough compensation for a single victim's case that was worth it to them being pro bono. It's already all set up, and I guess they saw the financial amount that they were going to request from the school and from the professor, and they were like, nah, this isn't enough. We have other stuff. And they just threw me to the side, wasted my time and my energy. And that was just it then. And I had to focus on my senior recital. I was like, I'll worry about this after my senior recital. I just need to do this. And I had asked them too. I was like, well, I've never filed a police report for this. Should I be doing that? And he said no. And months before that, I'd asked the women, I'm like, shouldn't I be filing a police report? Isn't that something I'm supposed to do? And they said no. They said, do not do that. We're handling this. But then I started researching my own, and I'm like, I'm supposed to do this thing. You screwed me over. So after my senior recital, I'm going to file a police report. When I had made this decision then to file the police report, I knew I didn't want to do it alone. And there was a friend that lived kind of close nearby, and she had already filed a police report for a sexual assault that happened to her. So I was like, can you come with me? And she said yes. She also put me in contact with another man that was a former law enforcement officer, also his girlfriend. They both like managed like safe houses for women and were huge survivor advocates for both sexual assault and domestic violence stuff. I had a phone call and they were like incredible, supportive. And he lived in a whole other state. He was hours from me. And with my consent, he drove to my state to be there while I filed the police report to make sure the officers didn't try to take advantage of me. So I was very lucky. I had a close friend with me, and it was one I'd opened up to over the summer already. So she had been following along my journey for a while. And then I also had this former law enforcement officer. I knew this was going to be bad. And I'm like, all right, it's going to be a total mess. I warned my friend, like, if I'm like really mean to you, like, I am so sorry in advance. And she was like, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine. And that day where we had scheduled to like do it and go together, I remember I had to go to class. And I was like crying in class that day, trying to like hide it. But from what I'd heard about filing police reports is that you have to write everything down. And I'm like, how do I write 2 years worth of stuff down? Like, I'm going to be there for hours. So that's what I was planning for. And we met the former law enforcement man there. So then it was all three of us there. And we had to go to a particular station. The former officer, who's super, super kind, he actually went up to the desk for me while I stood back with my friend. And then they summoned me up. And it was this like blonde lady, like officer. And she was like, okay, so what happened? And asked me that in front of everybody. And I'm like, I was like, well, it's kind of complicated. This stuff happened over 2 years. She's like, well, do you want to like talk in a back room? And I was like, yeah. Like, it's not what we're supposed to do. And she's like, okay, I'll go open up one of the rooms and we can talk back there. It's like, okay, like, why is this even a question? So I thought that was strange. And I was already thinking, here it comes. Like, I've heard all police officers are awful when you try to report sexual assault. So I'm like, here we go. I gave like a very vague, trying to get through how I met this professor, how everything happened. And I got up as far as to explaining in detail the first time he touched me in his office without my consent. And once I finished that, my voice was shaking. I have this former law enforcement man sitting there listening to me, and I have my close friend. She knew of what has happened to me, but she did not know that much detail. I was embarrassed for her to hear it too. And I was just like, but I gotta do what I gotta do. And so I finished it. And I remember I was like, and I was about to go on to the next part, to the second time that it happened. And the officer stopped me. She was just like, okay, stop, hold on. I'm an officer, but I need to stop you right there. Girl to girl, this was not your fault. Mm-hmm. And I was just like started crying. And she's like, it's okay to cry. And I'm like, no, it's not. I have to be strong. And she's like, no, it's okay to cry. The former law enforcement man, he brought like extra paper for me. He thought I was going to write stuff down, right? So he had all of his paper. He brought like tissues. He had everything, like extra water, like so kind. He's like, oh, let me scoot over. Let me make sure like your friend's closer to you in case she needs a hug. And I explained this was my first time ever having to file a police report. And she like explained like the process so thoroughly and was so wonderful as we went through like the details of everything else. Shock as she was hearing everything that had happened more in detail. But the way she was just like, she was just like in shock. And I was like, well, yeah, I'm like, it couldn't leave a mess. She's like, I need more paper. I need more paper, because she was trying to write this stuff down for me. And she's like, okay, let me go get like the official report number and everything. I'll be right back. Okay. And so then it was just me, my friend, and the former law enforcement officer in the room. And he had asked to see the evidence before, if it was comfortable with me. So I sent him the stuff. He had mentioned, he's like, yeah, to us three, he's like, yeah, I looked at the evidence with my girlfriend. We looked at it together the night before coming here. And, my girlfriend said, he needs to be put in a wood chipper going backwards and very slowly. And I couldn't help but start laughing. That's the first time I was able to like smile, and they made it so much easier for me by being there. And they made it so much safer. When she had came back, we talked about specific times, but she's like, I know you say this has happened a lot of times, but like, if you had to guess how many times it happened, how many would you say? And I was like, oh, I mean, maybe like 20, 30, something around there. And oh my God, the dead silence in the room when I said that was eerie. But the officer, she said she was very afraid for my safety. She was giving me safety advice. There was nothing she could do to protect me, but she was just simply giving me safety advice. And then when we were finally heading out, she handed me the police report. She said I'd get a call from the detective. And I remember her like following me out, and she said, go after him, get him his karma. And she wanted me to fight. When I had first filed that police report, honestly, I was like, this is as much as I'll do, because it's on file. So when he hurts other people, that's there. But after that, I was like, that was the best experience I've had talking about what I went through. That's what it should be. The officer, she told me to, if I had any questions or needed to just talk about anything, she gave me her name and she said I could call her the station anytime. So I was like, that's very nice. I'm like, awesome. Okay. I got a call from the detective just like 24 hours later. Like, it was very quick. And he's like, all right, so I received this report. When did this happen? And I was like, wasn't that on the report? Like, in my head, I'm like, we wrote down like dates, and I explained, I'm like, well, you know that this has happened multiple times and I do not recall specific dates. Like, a lot of that's just a blur to me. And he asked, he's like, did you get a rape kit? And I'm like, okay, you clearly haven't read the report because you don't even know what we're talking about here. Talking about like what evidence I had and stuff. And he's like, well, what kind of like texts do you have? And I'm like, well, I do have some texts. A lot of the conversations, though, him pushing me to do stuff, that happened over Instagram DM. Like, all that evidence like is right in there. Can't we recover those? And he's like, well, did you delete them? And I'm like, well, he took my phone and he deleted them, but I have a few that I'd screenshotted. I have some stuff. He told me social media stuff cannot be recovered, even in like a criminal investigation. So he said that was all gone for good. And he told me that we would set up an interview and he would have me talk about the specific dates and times that it happened. And I'm like, I told you, I do not remember specific dates and times. We're talking about what happened. I can give you this general area. All these things were happening from these few months on campus. Like, I have everything except that this exact time happened on March 13th. And this one happened on April 2nd at 7:32. Like, I don't have the specific, so he was just flustered. I didn't have that. The only thing he was really happy about was the fact that the professor had quit during the investigation. He's like, okay, good. That makes it look good. He's like, well, you're making a very serious accusation here. And there's lots of evidence that you sent me that I need to go through. So give me some time. So he hadn't looked at the report. Less than 24 hours later, he calls me again. And he's like, so when did you meet this man? And I was like, well, I mean, I met him when I started school. So I met him when I was 18. And he's like, okay, well, why did you say that you were groomed? And I was like, as I was. And he's like, no, grooming is when you're 17 and under. This is not going to fly in court. I was starting to like feel like I was going crazy. I mean, I had professionals, therapists tell me like, this is classic grooming.
Yeah, it was state by state. It's different. So we can't state that like it's obvious.
Yeah. He asked like, well, did you tell anyone while this was happening? And I was like, yeah, I told 3 people. And he said it didn't count if I didn't text. I had to have the text. It couldn't be in person. It couldn't be over the phone. I had to have texted somebody and have the text that said, Dr. Blank did this to me. He continued when I told him to stop it. And I was like, why would I text somebody that? I opened up to people that didn't know the professor. I wasn't going to say his name in the message. Like, who does that? I'm sorry. It made no sense. And I explained this and he's like, yeah, that makes it really, really hard. And I'm like, well, what about the Zoom call? It was recorded and he admitted to it. He admitted he continued when I said not to. And the detective accused me of a crime. And he said he could arrest me for recording that conversation because in our state, you can't record conversations without another person's consent. And he said if I were to press charges and I were to go forward with this report, I would be thrown into jail because I filmed that conversation. Like, but he admits to this and I'm going to be thrown in jail with a crime. And he told me, he's like, well, he could admit to like terrorism or murder, but you would still be arrested for recording it. And then he just told me, he's like, well, think about it this way, when he hurts somebody else, assuming that person stands up and wants to take this to court, your report's there. So you could be the next star witness. I think that's better for you. And he was so proud to say how amazing it would be if I would be the next star witness. And I'm like, so what about me? I was thinking, I'm like, okay, if it happens to somebody else, well, that's not okay if it happens to somebody else, but we're here about me. I filed this report for me. And I was so confused. I'm like, well, what is evidence? The pictures weren't proof enough. Testimony didn't matter. He said that could just be people lying on my behalf. I had his admission to what he did. Couldn't do that.
He was misrepresenting. Yeah, he was misrepresenting an interpretation of the law and oversimplifying it because he didn't want to do the work. Like, yes, just because certain things might be harder doesn't mean that testimony isn't evidence, He was just like, it's too, like, he wanted this to be open and shut, and sexual assaults don't work like that.
Yeah. I was sobbing and I felt so broken to feed. My recital was over. So like everything, like I felt like I was allowed to feel more. And I called the police officer, and she actually encouraged me to not report. And she wasn't like rude or disrespectful. She was honest, and she's like, think about it. Like, perpetrators never get put in jail. And when they do, it's for one night and they're on the street the next day. Like, you know, you would really be traumatizing yourself having to go through this. And I think we're more concerned about you right now. Don't think about him. And she really just encouraged me to move on, whatever that means to each individual. So to me, my closure was leaving reviews. I left reviews online for my lawyers. So anybody that were to go with those lawyers would know my experience. And I left a good review for the police officer that took my case, hoping that maybe more people go in to report. They'll get put with her for the report, and then it'll gradually change will happen and people will feel safer and more comfortable going in to report. I also filed a complaint, I guess. And I said, if I am ever sexually assaulted, I will never be going to the police for help again. What was the point of this? To me, like, that was all I could do. And I've been working on a lot more advocacy work, lots of research projects and other stuff. Even like doing these podcast episodes, sharing my story, because I know that there's a lot that people can relate to. And I think just speaking about it, that's just step one. Is it justice? No. But I don't think that there is justice at all for these sorts of things. So there could be, but we live in a system that chooses to not allow there to be any. So the harassment did not stop after this, although I felt like my story was kind of concluding. I don't think it truly has. One day, I was just chilling in my bed, eating some lunch. I was having a very productive day because I had lots of work and stuff I needed to catch up on. And mail comes to my house, physical mail. I get physical mail sometimes. So, you know, I'm just like, all right, go to open up this package. And I'm not really thinking like, what is it? Who is this? Whatever. I'm just kind of like opening it. And there was a letter inside, and it was typed, and it says, and I will read it: Dear Emily, I couldn't submit my donation online, and so I want to help bring your book to life. Here is some Go F Me money towards your Go F Me campaign, as real as your essay story, Kirsten. And so I'm in the process of writing a book. I've not announced what the book is about either. I've just said I'm writing one. There's a lot of like financial obstacles to writing a book that you have to pay for as well. So I did send up a GoFundMe for that. And that's already covered some of the costs that I've had to endure for my book. And I got this, and there was like a bunch of like fake cash in there too. And on the front, it was my full name and my full address. And this fake name, Kirsten Zwijack. And then it's like a fake address that goes to a mansion in Florida.
That's for sale.
Is for sale. Yes. Like, how did they get my address? Who has my address that would want to harass me? The professor. And that was all I was thinking about. And I was like, oh my God, would he do this? I called another friend and I was like, what do I do? And it was someone who had like social media experience. And I was like, maybe this person like, do you get harassment on social media? Like, maybe is this just more harassment? What do you do when it goes to the physical mail? And she's like, Emily, go to the police right now and file a police report. And I was like, okay. And so I had to go to the station, which was so triggering. I contacted one of my friends that actually lives very close to it. And I'm like, I need you to go to the police station with me. Can you come with me? And she's like, okay. And I hadn't seen her in months. I'm like, I just need you to go. So we went there, and it took forever for them to let us in, but finally they did. And it was a female officer. And she walked in the room laughing. And I'm like, well, this happened with the professor. And she's like, oh yeah, I know. We like looked up your records and stuff. Like, we already knew all that stuff. And I was like, oh, okay. And I explained everything going on, and she was just still laughing. And she looked at the letter and she laughed at the letter. She looked at the fake money and she's like, bet you wish this was real, huh? She's like, well, honestly, like, not much can really be done about this. Like, we'll give it to our detectives. I'll work on filing the police report, and I'll contact you. And she gave me like the number that I needed to have. I asked them like, well, what if I get more mail again? Like, do I just bring it here? And she was like, I mean, I guess if you want to, you could. And ever consider getting a PO box? And I was like, oh, how? I don't even know what to say. I'm like, what does that have to do with someone harassing me? Like, I don't ask for mail. I don't think I've ever had to like give my address out for somebody to send me something over mail. I mean, that's what the professor tried to do. And I said, no. I'm like, it's not that, like, at all. Like, I don't need a PO box. I just need to stop the harassment. And yeah, she really had nothing else to say. And my friend was there for the entire conversation, so she's heard all of it. I was freaked out. My parents were freaked out. We already have pretty good security, but she was very freaked out. My parents were mad. And the lieutenant that had helped with my situation a year ago, they emailed him and were like, what the heck? I was home alone that evening. I'm just trying to, you know, find some peace and relax. And I hear this like on my door, and I'm just like, oh my God. I'm like, what? I was able to see that it was a police officer. And I called the police station. I'm like, why are they here? And I was like, hi, I saw there was a police officer at my door. Why? And they're like, oh, it's just a follow-up about the report that you made. And I was like, okay. And they're like, we'll send him out again next week then to come to you when he's doing his rounds. And I teach privately in the evenings in person. And I was like, he's not coming up to my door while I have these kids over. And the parents, if the parents are there or not, I'd have to explain that to the parents. I'm like, you are not freaking these kids out. Like, no. And so I was like, can he just come back? I'm like, can he please just come back and I will open the door? He was much kinder. He asked me some questions. He's like, I'm not going to lie to you. Really, there's not much they can do. Like, it'll take 8 months for them to even get to this. They're going to go to the threats that say, I'm going to blow up your car, or I'm going to come find you and kill you. They're going to work on those before they get to your stuff. Yeah, he's like, it's so complicated. Like, I wish that there was more we could do, but there's not. And he also told me that the woman hadn't even finished filing the report yet. I asked him, I'm like, so what do I do then if I get more harassment in the mail? And he told me, he's like, bring it to us right away. As soon as you get something suspicious, even if it ends up not being something suspicious, you go straight to the station with it and we'll open it.
Don't open
and
it.
Like,
yeah.
Okay. So yeah. So I still deal with harassment to this day. Harassment never stops. I'm working on a lot of like advocacy work and projects, and it makes me feel good knowing I can help other people. And just by sharing my story, sitting down like this for the past 3 episodes, telling my story was a lot of effort and a lot of work. Yeah. It was not fun, but I'm very proud that I did it. I'm glad I survived it. I'm glad Claire survived it, because after these, like, we're both out for like days. All right. Thank you everyone so much for listening. If you missed part 1 or part 2 of my story, I recommend that you go back to that part. Feel free to listen to those episodes when you have the space to do so. And if you're curious more about my story and how these situations happen in the music world. If you have any feedback for our podcast, you can reach us at dissonantdialogues@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 872-216-9032. Also, if you would like to be a guest, if you have any feedback, have any topic ideas or any questions, you can reach out to us and give us a follow on our Instagram and our TikTok. We're Dissonant Dialogues on those platforms.
See you then. Bye. Oh, hello. It's got googly eyes.
Yeah, my mom killed mine. Like thousands. Well, I want to say thousands. Well, maybe. It's already like a little yellow flag starting to wave around.
Yeah.
Not red. So weird to talk about because I've had to keep this so secret, like in such secrecy. And I'm like, now I can talk about it. You want to think I'm stupid? When the one that looked like JJ walked in, I thought it was JJ. I'm like, she must be a lawyer in real life. Every single eye in that. And I'm trying to think of how much I can say about this. I guess we'll just finish it now. We don't have to do it Sunday.
Yeah.
Okay. Like, look, I have to say, look, girl, because I'm trying not to say her name. Like I was like, well, it's kind of complicated. We're done.
Okay.